Hey everybody, it's Mr. Harvey here. Gonna continue the third portion of this chapter. Please take notes while I'm lecturing, so you guys don't have to when I review this whole PowerPoint next Monday. Here we go, rock and roll. So we're gonna be talking about slavery, and we're gonna be talking about slavery as it relates to mercantilism and the Atlantic economy, and we're gonna be talking about also how slavery will develop racist ideologies, and racist ideologies will be a justification for the institution of slavery. So let's jump right in. Okay, slavery and the African presence in the Americas. Okay, slavery. Now, don't fall in this trap. Slavery had always existed in some form in parts of Europe since ancient times, since the beginning of human civilization. Slavery is not this new thing that comes about during this time. So please don't fall into that trap on the AP test and be like, slavery was no, it was not new. Okay, but we see during the 16th century, 17th century that slavery, especially African slavery, will become a very fundamental part of the world, especially in these mercantile empires that we're going to see in the Atlantic economy. Some of the main players that you should know that are involved in this are the British, most notably seen in America, the Spanish, Portuguese, and the Dutch. Okay, let's not forget about the Dutch. All right, why African slaves? Well, the natives are dead. The natives have been killed by the terrible disease that that they were not immune to: smallpox, measles, influenza. The natives are dead, and so Europeans are going to turn to a population that is immune to these diseases. The closest population we see that they can mass enslave will be in Africa. And another reason why we see slavery take off during this time is the cash crops. Cash crops were a fundamental part of the mercantilist empires of Europe during this time, and cash crops such as sugar, cotton, coffee, tobacco are going to drive the need for slaves. So why does this occur? The labor shortage and the cash crops. That is why we see Africans from Africa are going to be taken as slaves and participate against their will in this mercantilist economy of the world. How did the system kind of work? Well, we see in Africa during this time, I'm not going to get too in depth because this is not a class on African culture, African history. I would love to teach that class though. We see tribal warfare in Africa. It's not a new thing. It's not an old thing. And with tribal warfare, we do see some African tribes, especially in West Africa, enslave each other. And so there will be already a supply of slaves for Europeans to come over, trade for, that they can take to work on the plantations in the New World. And so with African warfare, we do see slave markets on the West African coast. They're not necessarily controlled by Europeans. They are also controlled by mainly controlled by other West African tribes. And these slaves in these slave markets were not this new thing. They were pre-existing and had existed before the time of mercantilism. Important to know that we start to see African slaves show up earlier in the Portuguese and Spanish New World, in New Spain, in Brazil, the West Indies, and we start to see in the 1600s and 17th century in British North America, we will start to see slaves first brought over by the Dutch, and then the British will have a partial control of the slave trade. The British will get involved in their own slave trade. And the slave trade will grow up until the 19th century. The slave trade will eventually be abolished. But the slave trade is really going to take off in the 1700s because slaves are going to be dying at such a rapid rate. They're not going to be reproducing at a rapid rate because they're being worked to death in their communities are being decimated by overwork, poor living conditions, awful working conditions, and so there needs to be there will be an established slave trade in order to replenish those populations of slaves, because the slave communities won't be able to have a stable self-reproducing population. And this slide just kind of shows the order of the slave trade on who dominated it. First will be dominated by the Portuguese and Spanish. The Dutch will have control of the slave trade, and then eventually the British. And slavery was heavily involved in that triangular trade, and we discussed that in chapter 2. And I think I have a picture. I have a picture later. We can kind of go through it. But it was that triangular trade where you see raw materials from North America go over to Europe. Europe will trade down to Africa. You know, some of the manufactured goods that they're making from those raw materials, they'll trade them down for African slaves. Then Europeans will bring the slaves over to the New World, where then we will see the New World, use those slaves to, gather and make more raw materials and, harvest those raw materials, send them back over to Europe. Europe will be sending some of those manufactured goods to trade for the slavers, and we see that triangular trade go around. And as you can see from this picture, awful conditions, inhumane conditions, but you'll notice that the important part of this picture is to show that who were African slavers? They were Africans themselves, rival tribes. Okay, as you can see, there is an African male. He has a European musket. He has, it seems, some European clothing on, that he obviously acquired from Europe in exchange for some previous slaves that he held. Okay, this picture shows the Middle Passage that we talked about, the terrible transportation of slaves from Africa to the New World, where slaves were chained, put together, and just kept below decks in these awful conditions. Many of them died on this passage due to the awful conditions that they were in, and this was just a really terrible aspect of slavery. I mean, the whole institution was awful. This was definitely one of those terrible parts of slavery. And this is the map I was referring to a little bit, but this can show you the major trading routes of slavery during this time. As you can see, a lot of the slaves originated from West Africa, off this coast right here, the west coast of Africa right here. You can see a lot of them going to Brazil, Mexico, Central America, Mexico, West Indies, and to British America, the United States right here. And this triangular trade I was referring to, right, was raw materials going to Europe, Europe trading down for slaves, and slaves being sent. So it's kind of just like bam, 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 a little triangle, the triangular trade. So this map kind of shows you of where the slaves were headed. And some slaves, as you can see right here, headed back to Europe, but the majority of them were heading to the New World. Okay. Here we go. Historians estimate that there are about 9 million Africans or more brought to the Americas over a period of 400 years. Slaves who had been slaves longer, veteran slaves, if you would say, were worth more than slaves who weren't used to being slaves. These slaves lived in terrible conditions in the plantations, difficult lives, and slavery didn't really differ throughout the New World. It was pretty terrible, pretty awful living conditions. These slaves were treated inhumanely. The institution altogether was awful. Cultural. Slaves and African slaves will bring a lot of their culture, their language, their religious beliefs, social structure, and some of their governmental beliefs, and we will see in the New World some blending and some cultural blending of European culture from the European captors with the African slaves, and we will see that we will see some slaves mix Christianity with their African religions, as like Native Americans, we will see the African communities be forced to Christianity, and so during this time, and I'll review this a little bit in class, but we will see African culture and European culture really meld in these slave communities. Let's talk about racism. Racism is a very ugly part of this time, but it's very important to talk about, and it is very obviously relevant to the institution of slavery. So let's talk about it. European racial attitudes. Well, and this is fascinating. Of where does racism come from? Racism isn't innate in people. It comes from somewhere, and it comes from humans. It comes from us. We create racism, and so the idea of slavery helped create racism and racist ideologies towards slaves during the 19th century. And the idea of racism is going to be a justification for why Europeans can enslave Africans. And we see racism start to show up in European culture and language, and we start to see Europeans attach negative meaning to the idea of blackness. And I'll talk about this more in class. But Europeans are going to justify their ability of going and taking Africans over to the New World as slaves and treating them from an inferior standpoint by calling them savages, an inferior people, and that they're bringing them over to the New World, and that they're helping them learn Christianity, the right religion, and not their heathen gods, and they're teaching them, giving them European clothes, and etc. But we see Europeans start to use that justification, and it melds into their language and their culture, and we start to see them use that justification, and it becomes racism. And a really good example of this can be seen in language. Just think about the connotation and meaning of black versus white. You have a black soul, you have a dark soul. That's not a nice thing to say. Why? Well, the idea of black is considered bad. That word, darkness has enveloped all of us. It's a dark day. It's a bad day. That idea of darkness and black has negative meaning, and that comes from Europeans attaching negative meaning to the idea of black. Think about vice versa for white, lightness, purity, right? The angels are light. You are guided by the light, or the light that's shining at the end of the doorway. Light is something seen as positive in language, in English language, and that is no coincidence. In that Europeans are going to develop these racial ideologies, and they're going to start attaching, positive meaning towards light and negative meaning towards darkness. And racism will be the justification for maintaining this system of slavery within the world until the 1800s, where we see the slave trade start to be abolished. We see slave societies deconstructed in the 19th century. We do see America, get rid of, abolish slavery, and we'll talk about that in Europe, and you'll learn more about that America next year in APUSH. But we will see racism be used as a justification for the system of slavery. The system of slavery will go away in the 19th century, but unfortunately, racism will still exist, and as we all know today, it still exists today. Important to know. And here's just another picture of a slave, a plantation, cultivating cash crop. It looks like they're harvesting sugar cane. And let's move on. Okay, this picture is very interesting. It shows Africans wearing some traditional African garb, but also some European clothing. And this picture, and I'll talk about this more in class, really illustrates the melding of these European cultures with the African cultures, and how these African societies kind of mixed both of both those cultures into their own unique society. Okay, let's stop there, and we will continue this in the next lecture. Here we go. Stop there.